My husband on the autism spectrum, he has high functioning autism, is very stubborn and is often angry. He also has severe anxiety. Is it possible that the anxiety is causing him to act out in various ways? Well, the short answer to that would be yes, pretty much 100% of the time. A common theme does exist among people with Asperger's and high-functioning autism, specifically their tendency to exhibit both behavioral and cognitive rigidity, which spouses often perceive as stubbornness and being insensitive, selfish, uncaring, narcissistic, and numerous other adjectives. But the behavioral and cognitive rigidity that gets perceived as just rude behavior is definitely a response to anxiety. There's a strong correlation between anxiety and inflexibility, and that can be evident at home, and it also can be evident in the workplace. So a vulnerability to anxiety is definitely an intrinsic feature of Asperger's or high-functioning autism, and that's due to three different things, really. It's due to a specific neurotransmitter system defect. It's also due to a breakdown in circuitry related to extinguishing fear responses. And it's also a secondary consequence of the individual's inability to make appropriate social judgments. So there's numerous factors at play that increase anxiety in people on the autism spectrum. I could spend the next hour talking about that, but I'll try to keep this answer fairly short. A lack of empathy significantly limits skills for autonomous social problem solving. For example, the individual is unaware in many cases that he has said hurtful things or behaved in inappropriate ways. And this results in him, we'll use the example of an NT wife and the husband with autism. This behavior that he exhibits often gets him in trouble with his wife. I work with men on the autism spectrum a lot, and it seems like they all say, yeah, they're in the doghouse, and they feel like they're always in trouble. So this all relates to a lack of empathy, or we will call it a lack of displayed empathy. They have empathy, they just don't necessarily display it. And this limits skills for autonomous social problem solving. Social problem solving, that's an important term to remember. Limitations in generalizing from one situation to another often contribute to in this case, the autistic husband repeating the same social mistakes over and over again. If he gets into a heated argument with his NT wife over a specific problem, and she conveys to him what he needs to do differently next time, he will get it with that specific problem. But if there's a second problem that's just slightly different, he may not necessarily be able to generalize from the first problem to the second problem. Also, another factor that is at play that increases anxiety is the individual's inability to grasp social cues, facial expressions, body language, and so on. So this creates a lot of repeated social errors because he's misinterpreting what is being expressed to him. Social limitations also make it difficult for him to develop coping strategies to soothe himself and to contain difficult emotions. And so those are just a few. There's many more. The circumstances that raise the anxiety level for people on the autism spectrum often result in their increased need to control people, places, and things. This need for control takes the form of rigidity, which is what you were referring to in your question as stubbornness. So there's behavioral rigidity and cognitive rigidity. Behavior rigidity refers to the person's difficulty in maintaining appropriate behavior in new and unfamiliar situations. Okay? And then there's cognitive rigidity, and this occurs when the individual is unable to consider alternatives to the current situation, alternative viewpoints, or innovative solutions to a problem. People with rigid thinking do tend to view situations in either or terms. It's either right or wrong, good, bad, black, white. They want concrete black and white answers, and the gray areas of life are often very uncomfortable for people with behavioral and cognitive rigidity. Symptoms of rigidity often introduce some of the most disruptive chronic behaviors exhibited by people on the autism spectrum. For example, aggression, difficulties tolerating changes in routine, dislike of changes to plans that have been previously laid out. You may have experienced with your partner on the spectrum his or her meltdowns, frustration, shutdowns, and problems with minor differences in the environment. I get a lot of feedback from NT wives that say they feel that they're always walking on eggshells in an effort to circumvent any extreme reaction from their very brittle Asperger's husband. In addition, the husband himself may articulate his anxiety over fears that things will not go according to plan, or that he'll be forced to make changes that he can't handle. Sometimes these behaviors are identified as obsessive compulsive because of the husband's need for ritualized order or non-functional routine. In other words, he has a strong need for sameness. So, as one can easily imagine, behavioral and cognitive rigidity causes many problems in relationships, which usually result in a higher level of anxiety for the person on the autism spectrum. Therefore, this cycle just continues at that point. Hey guys, this is Mark Hutten with AdultAspergersChat.com, and I wanted to talk to the men out there on the autism spectrum who have anxiety. And if you're like most, as in like 100% of other people on the autism spectrum, anxiety just comes with the territory, right? But I don't want you to view anxiety as altogether a bad thing. Actually, there's a part of anxiety that is a good thing, even a survival mechanism. Now, we certainly don't want to have anxiety over everything all the time, but we are designed to have some anxiety over some things some of the time. So anxiety is actually a call to action. If you have some unresolved anxiety in your relationship, your anxiety is telling you that there is something not working quite right and change needs to happen. So it's good that you have some anxiety. If you don't have anxiety, you're either dead or you're a psychopath. And if you're listening to this video, you're not dead. And if you're not in prison, chances are pretty good you're not a psychopath. The message today is for you to view some of your anxiety as a call to action. It's a message that your brain is trying to send to you saying something is not functioning the way it can be and we need to change it. On that note, I have a men's group coming up for people on the autism spectrum who are having trouble in their relationships, and you don't have to have a formal diagnosis to join this group. So check it out, click on the link below. As you may know, if you have Asperger's syndrome, or if you live with somebody who has Asperger's syndrome, anxiety is a huge issue. I would say pretty much everybody who has Asperger's or high-functioning autism also by default has anxiety issues. And I want to talk briefly about that. You know, when you're afraid of, you can think of fear as you're afraid of something and you know exactly what it is. You know, you have to go to the dentist next week and have a root canal, or have some other medical procedure done, or you have a job interview, or you're going to have to go have dinner with the in-laws. There's some future event, and you know that you know exactly what it is, and it does create a bit of angst inside of you. Then there's anxiety, which is you're afraid of something, but you don't know what it is. It's kind of mysterious. So if you are having anxiety, you're worried about something in the future that hasn't happened yet, and quite honestly, may never happen. How many times have you worried about something and the thing never happened? If you're honest with yourself, that's about 99% of the time. So, in this sense, anxiety is fiction. You're spending a lot of time and mental energy, which is exhausting, by the way, on something that doesn't exist. Think about this. Anxiety is nothing more than your thoughts. It's not something outside of you. If you're anxious about something, it's not some external thing that you need to be concerned about, some boogeyman that's going to get you. It's something inside of your damn head. It's inside of you. It's not something looming outside of you that you don't have any control over. It's inside of your brain, and you do have control over that. You have to learn that skill. It's not something you can just will yourself to do. You're going to have to practice. You're going to have to train how to do various anxiety reduction techniques. And there are plenty of those. So, on that note, I have a few links underneath this video if you want to explore this further. Thanks, guys. This is Mark Hutten with AdultAspergersChat.com.
Mark, I have a question, and I'm okay with you adding my voice message and your answer to a public YouTube video. My question is, what's the best way for people with Asperger's to manage their anxiety? Thank you, Ken.
Well, in answer to the question, there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all or a cookie-cutter approach for anxiety, because what causes your anxiety might not cause anxiety for somebody else, and what alleviates your anxiety might not alleviate that anxiety in somebody else. So it's going to be a very individual approach to find out what works best for you. But let's make a distinction between fear and anxiety, because fear is something that you're afraid of, but you know exactly what it is. For example, let's say you hate going to the dentist and you've got to go to the dentist next week, and you know you're going to sit there and get a cavity worked on, and you kind of predict what's going to go on. You already know, because you've been there and done it before. So yes, there's some apprehension there, but you know what's going to happen. Anxiety, though, is being afraid of something and you don't know what it is. You just know that you feel anxious, and the anxiety that's going on in the moment is not the event itself, because you don't even know what the event is. It's your self-talk. So we have to look at self-talk. So if the event actually manifests itself in your life, the one that you've been worrying about so much, that actual event will be way less emotionally painful than the worrying about that event prior to the actual occurrence. The actual event is not the source of your anxiety. It's the thinking about the event that is the source of your anxiety. Think of it like this. Let's say you're in college, you've got a big exam coming up, maybe it's the final, and it's super important that you get a good grade on this. And maybe you have some test anxiety, and so you engage in this if-then business. If I freeze up, then I might flunk this test. Or if it's harder than I think, and if I didn't study enough for this test, I may get a bad grade. And if I don't pass this exam, I may flunk the course. And if I flunk the course, I may have to take it again. And if I have to take the course again, then it's going to take longer for me to get my degree. And if it takes longer for me to get my degree, it's going to cost me more money. And if my parents are helping me financially, they may get upset with me for taking longer than expected. And so you get in this if-then loop, a bunch of what ifs, and that is the anxiety. Another example is there was a lady who had IBS symptoms, and it triggered her anxiety, and so her commute was particularly stressful. So she gets up and she starts having some stomach issues, and then she starts getting sucked into this if-then loop. If I have stomach troubles this morning, then I'm going to have anxiety on the way to work. And if I have anxiety on the way to work, then I'm going to have to stop at a gas station somewhere on an emergency basis. And if I do that, then I'm going to be late for work. And if I'm late for work, then I'm going to get a point. And if I get too many points, I'm going to get fired. And so you're down in this rabbit hole of what ifs. There again, that is the anxiety, not so much the drive to work in and of itself. So you get the point, right? The anxiety is the what if business. It is the if-then loop that you get sucked into. So what we can do in that case is we can look for triggers to our anxiety and maybe even journal those. It wouldn't necessarily have to be a notebook. It could be one piece of paper. And so after you have an anxiety-provoking event and you're calm, you could write down, okay, what happened right before I got anxious? That is the trigger. And then you would also want to write down what was my self-talk during this anxiety-provoking event. So let's use an example of a husband on the autism spectrum, and his neurotypical wife is upset about something, and so she is asking a lot of questions. You know, maybe she's saying things like, why can't you ever blah, 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 or why do you always do such and such, or what were you thinking when you didn't follow through with blah, blah, blah. And so she's upset and she's kind of interrogating, and so that is the anxiety-provoking event. And then maybe your self-talk was, oh my God, here we go again, complain, complain, complain. I'm always in trouble. I didn't do anything wrong. Why is she treating me like a child? I feel so criticized. I have to defend myself. I have to prove that she is wrong, etc. So in this example, her complaints about the relationship not going right did download as a trigger for you, but it was the self-talk that exacerbated the anxiety. So what do we want to do? We want to begin the business of practicing different self-talk. So using the example that I just illustrated where she is upset and she's kind of quizzing you, why can't you do this? Why do you always do that? Because she's frustrated and at her wit's end, and you're downloading that as nothing but criticism and put downs and shaming and blaming. So what could you do differently next time in the way of self-talk? Here's some ideas. I could realize that she's quizzing me because the relationship is really important to her. Another thought could be, I'll stay and listen, and then I'll paraphrase back what I heard so I can understand her point. In other words, I'm going to listen to understand rather than listen to mount a defense. Another thought could be, I'll ask what I can do to help rather than just do some version of shutdown or meltdown. So we want to replace the negative self-talk that sets us up for the if-then loop with more positive, constructive, and realistic inner dialogue that is more representative of what might actually be going on. So in summary, the best anxiety reduction strategy for you will be for you to identify what types of self-talk you engage in when you're in the throes of a particular anxiety-producing event. And each event will trigger different self-talk. You want to look at those, and you want to begin the process of coming up with some deliberate replacements for the negative self-talk. So that's the key term, deliberate. You will have to start thinking deliberately when you're in the middle of the storm. A meltdown can be viewed as consisting of three phases. There's the escalation of anxiety, the explosion of pent-up anxiety, and post-explosion. Together, they make up the meltdown cycle. In this process, the escalation phase is characterized by cues that indicate anxiety is building. Now, these cues can be physical, behavioral, emotional, or cognitive, and they are warning signs or responses to anxiety-provoking events. Events, on the other hand, are situations that occur every day that may lead to escalations of anxiety if effective anxiety control methods are not used. Red flag events are types of situations that are unique to you and that you are especially sensitive to because of past events. And these events can involve internal processes, for example, thinking about situations that were anxiety-provoking in the past, or external processes, for example, experiencing real-life anxiety-provoking situations in the here and now. If the escalation phase is allowed to continue, the explosion phase will follow. Now, the explosion phase is marked by an uncontrollable discharge of anxiety displayed as verbal or physical aggression. Now, this discharge in turn leads to negative consequences, and it's synonymous with the number 10 on a emotional dysregulation meter. You could think of this meter as similar to a thermometer. The final stage of the meltdown cycle is the post-explosion phase, and it's characterized by negative consequences that resulted from the verbal or physical aggression that was displayed during the explosion phase. These consequences could include feelings of guilt, shame, regret, a post-meltdown shutdown. In other words, he explodes and then later on he goes and hibernates and isolates and tries to stay away from people. Separation or divorce, family members and friends that no longer want to be around you, being terminated from a job, and in some cases even going to jail. Now, the intensity, frequency, and duration of anxiety in a meltdown cycle varies among individuals. For example, one person's anxiety may escalate rapidly after a provocative event and within just a few minutes reach the explosion phase. Another's anxiety may escalate slowly but steadily over several hours before reaching the explosion phase. So it will be important to understand your pattern here. In other words, do you go from 1 to 100 miles an hour quickly, or do you creep up from 1 mile an hour to 100 miles an hour over the course of several minutes or even up to an hour? Also, one may experience more episodes of anxiety and progress through the meltdown cycle more often than the other. However, both people, despite differences in how quickly their anxiety escalates and how frequently they experience anxiety, will undergo all three phases of the meltdown cycle. The intensity of anxiety from one person to the next also will be different. One person may engage in more violent behavior than the other in the explosion phase. For example, he might assault someone. The other person may express his anxiety during the explosion phase by shouting at or threatening another person. But regardless of these individual differences, the explosion phase is synonymous with losing control and becoming verbally or physically aggressive, and we call this emotional dysregulation. Another term that is used but doesn't quite capture the severity of this situation is low frustration tolerance. Now, notice that the escalation and explosion phases of the meltdown cycle correspond to the levels on the emotional dysregulation meter. The points below 10 on the meter represent the escalation phase, or the building up of anxiety. The explosion phase, on the other hand, corresponds to 10 on this meter, and it is kind of an imaginary meter at this point. So again, 10 on the meter is the point at which one loses control and expresses anxiety through verbal or physical aggression that leads to negative consequences. One of the primary objectives of anxiety control treatment is to keep from reaching the explosion phase. And this is accomplished by using the emotional dysregulation meter to monitor changes in your anxiety, attending to the cues or warning signs that indicate anxiety is building, and employing the appropriate methods from your anxiety control plan to stop escalation. If the explosion phase is prevented from occurring, the post-explosion phase will not occur and the meltdown cycle will be broken. So if you use your anxiety control plan effectively, your anxiety should ideally reach between a 1 and a 9 on the emotional dysregulation meter. By preventing the explosion phase, which is a 10, you will not experience the same level of negative consequences of the post-explosion phase, and you will then be able to break the destructive cycle. Hey guys, this is Mark Hutten with AdultAspergersChat.com, and I often get a lot of neurotypical spouses wanting to inquire about why their partner with Asperger's syndrome or high-functioning autism has meltdowns. And I got an email recently, and I get a lot of these, and in essence, this is a neurotypical wife, and she's wanting to understand more fully why her Asperger's husband has meltdowns. Before we can address that, we'll have to look at anxiety, because a meltdown or a shutdown is a result of high anxiety. And so you could think of a meltdown as simply a symptom of anxiety. If your husband, for example, who has Asperger's syndrome, goes into a meltdown or a shutdown, you can bet that what preceded that was something that raised his anxiety. We'll just call this the anxiety cycle, and a meltdown will be part of this cycle. So unfortunately, it's very common for people with Asperger's to experience more than their fair share of stress. And honestly, to make matters worse, many of these people lack the ability to manage their stress effectively. They've come up with some coping mechanisms to deal with it, and unfortunately, many of these mechanisms are dysfunctional. In other words, they kind of make a bad problem worse, or they solve the problem temporarily only. So individuals with Asperger's are particularly prone to anxiety disorders as a consequence of the social demands made on them. Any social contact can generate anxiety as to how to start, maintain, and end the activity or conversation. Changes to daily routine can exacerbate the anxiety, and also certain sensory sensitivities can also contribute to that. Many of my clients have reported feeling anxious for no apparent reason at all. They were fine the previous day, they wake up, they get started with their day, and for some reason they're anxious, and they can't pinpoint it. They can't attribute it to any particular event or something that somebody said or did. So not only do people with Asperger's and high-functioning autism experience anxiety, oftentimes it's random and for no apparent reason. Perhaps some of these individuals take life too seriously. Perhaps they take others' behavior and comments too personally. And perhaps they just generally view themselves as worrywarts, and so they've kind of labeled themselves that way. And so chronically worrying that something bad will happen or something good won't happen has honestly just become a habit. And that's an important concept. Once you have anxiety for a period of time, it actually becomes a habit, and it operates at an unconscious level. So that's the first thing that happens in this business that relates to a meltdown, is the anxiety piece. What follows then is the need for anxiety reduction, of course. Nobody can go through day after day, 365 days a week under high anxiety without having some kind of problem or searching for some kind of remedy. And as I mentioned a little bit ago, unfortunately, in many cases, their anxiety reduction techniques actually create more problems, or further their anxiety, or drive people away, or can result in school suspension, job loss, divorce, and so on. So they do try to manage their anxiety in healthful ways. They think for example, distracting themselves by engaging in their special interest for excessive amounts of time. Some people turn to marijuana, some people turn to alcohol, various things, and some work to some degree, some don't work at all, and some only work temporarily. But the two main things that they do for anxiety reduction would be, of course, the shutdown, and that is where they just hibernate. They just want to be by themselves, and they withdraw, don't want to talk to anybody. They just want to temporarily take a time out and escape from the world. And then the other thing they do, the opposite end of the spectrum of a shutdown, would be the meltdown, and that's what we're trying to address today. So as this anxiety, whatever its cause, builds up and builds up, eventually the dam breaks, so to speak, usually over something very small. It's literally the straw that breaks the camel's back. Under severe enough stress, any normally calm and collected person with Asperger's may become totally out of control and have a huge explosion. And that's usually what people see when they see somebody having a meltdown. So those who experience meltdowns are often perceived by others as always being angry. I hear from neurotypical spouses all the time that their Asperger's husband only shows anger. When he's sad, it shows up as anger. If he's mad, it shows up as anger. If he's depressed, all he displays is anger. Even though they do have several emotions underneath there, they only show the surface emotion, which is anger. Rage may be a common reaction experienced when coming to terms with problems in employment, relationships, friendships, and other areas in life affected by Asperger's. There is often this on-off quality to the person's rage, where the person may be calm minutes later after a meltdown, while the people around are stunned and shocked that what they just witnessed. And so, in this case, the Asperger's man is, after he's had his meltdown, 5 minutes later he's fine, and everybody else is still going, what the hell happened, and they're still in a state of shock. Neurotypical spouses often struggle to understand these meltdowns, with resentment and bitterness often building up over time. In some cases, the Asperger's individual may not even acknowledge he has trouble with rage, and he will blame others for provoking him. And as you can well imagine, this creates a lot of conflict in the marriage. There would literally be hundreds of examples of how meltdowns can play out, but for the sake of this video here, we're going to just discuss the following example, and we'll apply this example throughout. So, let's say the Asperger's individual's had a rough day at work, but he was able to kind of maintain his composure for the most part through the day. But when he gets home, his wife makes a comment that she didn't think was particularly provoking or upsetting, but that hits the man wrong for some reason, and he explodes. So in other words, he kind of takes out his anxiety that he experienced through the day. He takes that out on his wife, unintentionally, of course. I mean, it wasn't premeditated. He didn't think on the way home, I'm going to give my wife hell when I walk in the door. But he was already in a position where he was about to explode, and it didn't take much more steam to blow the lid off of that kettle. So the next phase in this anxiety cycle is guilt. And we're going to use the example of the guy coming home from work, okay? So if this particular scenario plays itself out numerous times over months and years, in other words, it seems to be a theme or a pattern that he always comes home in a bad mood and to one degree or another takes it out on his wife, the Asperger's husband in this case will come to believe that he's the victim of his emotions. In this case, work-related stress expressed in the form of misplaced anger toward his wife. But not only does he feel like a victim of circumstances, he also feels an element of guilt and remorse for hurting the people that he loves. He may have tried numerous times to avoid repeating this scenario, where he comes home and he knows he's taking out his anger on his wife when really it should have been directed at the coworker that pissed him off earlier in the day. But even though he tries to avoid the meltdown, he still has this work-related stress that's unresolved, and he hasn't figured out a way to deal with this stress in a functional, non-destructive way. So since he keeps repeating this same cycle that he doesn't want to repeat, he's beginning to feel very guilty about the whole damn thing. So what do you do when you have ongoing toxic guilt? Well, what happens next in this cycle is self-punishment. As a result of repeated social failures, in other words, in this case, numerous negative encounters with his wife, the person with Asperger's may come to the conclusion that he doesn't deserve love, he doesn't deserve compassion, he doesn't deserve to have a peaceful lifestyle. Therefore, he may do destructive things to punish himself. For example, beating up on himself with negative self-talk, drinking or drug use, overeating, isolation, and possibly even separation or divorce. In other words, he's the one that initiates separation or divorce because he thinks that he deserves that. Guilt is supposed to be a pro-social emotion. In other words, it functions to preserve important relationships. But many people with Asperger's who experience repeated exposures to this anxiety cycle that we're talking about here have unresolved guilt, which literally prevents them from enjoying life and thriving emotionally. Instead, they're just trying to survive life, and they're just trying to survive emotionally. So the whole thing started off with anxiety. He tried to reduce his anxiety, in this case with numerous dysfunctional methods that didn't work. And so since he couldn't come up with an anxiety reduction method that worked, he went to the default meltdown. In other words, the anxiety built up so much that he couldn't even engage in any kind of hopeful interventions at that point. It was just explosion time. Then he feels guilty for these explosions. Then he punishes himself for these explosions, and we've gone full circle right back to anxiety again, because all of these different steps in the cycle are hugely stressful. So months or even years of experiencing numerous negative emotions, stress, frustration, anger, rage, guilt, and so on, obviously can make relationships so problematic that the better option becomes living alone or avoiding human contact as much as possible. In many cases, the man gets divorced and he just decides, I'm never getting married again. I'm never going to try this love thing again. I suck at it and I hurt people and I'm just better off left to my own company. But unfortunately, all of us are social creatures by nature. As human beings, we need other people. Therefore, living a life of solitude carries its own element of anxiety because people need other people. And so when he chooses a solitary lifestyle, he's by default chosen to make his anxiety even worse. So I think that describes the anxiety cycle that includes the meltdown business that we were focusing on. And there's some links underneath this video if you guys want to get a hold of me. If you're somebody with Asperger's syndrome and you need some assistance, or if you're the spouse of someone with Asperger's syndrome, be sure to click on the links below and get a hold of me and we will talk. Thanks guys. Mark Hutten, AdultAsperger'sChat.com.